Welcome to a Tippling Philosopher. This is another interview. Looking forward to this. This is an interview with Apologist, who is a new blogger on the scene. So hopefully some really interesting stuff from Apologist. A few questions to ask, and we'll hopefully have a nice informal sort of chat and talk about, I don't know, philosophy, the world, and everything. So, hi, Apologist. Do you want to introduce yourself to whoever might listen to this interview?
Sure. I just kind of started blogging. I go by Apologist on the internet. I haven't really kind of come out with a name, although here's my face. So I pretty much, long and short of it, I deconverted from being a fundamentalist for over 20 years. It's coming up on 3 years now, which is pretty good. And after deconverting and bringing my wife with me, pretty much I found out I liked philosophy, and I had tried to reconvert myself back because I didn't want to, my wife still believed for a little while there, so I threw myself into apologetics, and through reading it and then all the counter replies, I found out, hey, this is actually philosophy in general. You learn a lot in the process of debunking all these bad arguments, and I kind of liked it, and I wanted to kind of throw out like here's how you debunk the standard apologetic arguments for people, because it was really helpful for me, because when I was deconverting, the internet was the easiest way I've had. I mean, I purchased some books, but, things get expensive.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so, that's the most of it, I think.
So you produce a really interesting deconversion account on your blog, which I've linked to on my blog. Well, actually, I reposted on my blog in sheer laziness. So that was really fascinating. Can you talk us through just what were the motivational sort of moments that caused your deconversion?
Okay. So I grew up quickly fundamentalist, family converted from being Catholic when I was like 9, did the whole Jesus in the heart thing, redid it when I was like 11, to make sure. I was always in fundamentalist schools.
What does that, can I just interrupt? What does that, because in Britain, we don't really have hardcore fundamentalist Christianity in the same way that you do in the States. So when you say Jesus in the heart, right, to a British guy, that really just is Greek. So, what does that mean?
Okay, so it depends on the sect of Christianity that you come from, because it's pretty broad. But basically, what it means is you're supposed to pray a prayer that is you basically say Jesus. It's acknowledging that you are a sinner and that Jesus Christ died for your sins, and you're asking His Spirit or the Holy Spirit to come into your heart and live within you. That's the Baptist. We converted into being Baptist after being Catholic. And so that is the Savior, or the sinner's prayer that is supposed to be, that is the moment, or at least that version of Baptist taught us, that was the moment you were saved, if you prayed the prayer.
Right.
So, I mean, that was pretty much...
So it's a kind of acceptance that God likes sort of rituals with certain words, and if you don't give those certain words, then I'm sorry, you're not in the club.
Right. Well, you can... So, like the tracks and stuff that you'll see, or the outreach meetings that they made us go to and try to bring our friends to when we were kids, they have that whole, here's a certain word thing, and you pray the sinner's prayer, and then you're saved. Right. But if you look into the more sophisticated theology, then there's the whole, it's a matter of belief, it's faith, and so the prayer is just a proclamation of faith. As long as you mean it, and even if you don't get the magic words right, it's cool.
Right. Okay, cool.
Right.
So sorry, I interrupted you. Carry on.
No, that's fine. So I had the younger creationist stuff in school, so there was no there was no real, nothing was allowed to conflict with my views. Basically, is what it was, and I even wanted to go to the schools once we had moved states, and basically I wanted to go to the Christian schools, and so I don't want this to make it all sound like I'm bagging on my parents at all. This was not like it wasn't an insulating thing. Although I was insulated. So I went to college. I went to an engineering school, and you'd think this is where you lose your faith. It ended up where I did not go to church. I started doing all the wonderful things that boys do when they go to college, and there was schisms and all that crap. point being, I stopped being a young Earth creationist at the time because that was what I was raised in. I got a healthy dosage of science, and I'm a computer engineer by training.
Right.
So physics and speed of light and whole 6,000 years old thing doesn't work out really well. And it was a Muslim professor that taught me that no, it's compatible with theism. And basically, long and short of it, met my wife, converted her, and we settled down into a fundamentalist style church, pretty conservative, evangelical Presbyterian. And everything was good. I was a sound guy. I was a volunteer, Bible studies, whole 9 yards. And the problem was I had friends who turned out to be gay from college. And we became very good friends. And we were pretty much the only geeks in the church. Well, one of the few geeks in the church. And we didn't really know the other ones. So we hung out with our geek friends, which included now a gay couple. And pretty much.
So, sorry to interrupt again, but so was this gay person in the church as well?
No.
Oh right, yeah. I was going to say.
Met him. Right. I met him while I was working at like a game store when I was in college. Right. And he ended up knowing my wife from before I met her.
Right.
And so he came out, and I like freaked. Growing up, especially in the evangelical school and that whole living in the church thing. That was like the worst thing ever. Like you could not be gay. Like it was evil, pretty much.
Yeah.
And so, my wife basically made me not be a bigot, which was cool. Yeah. And eventually that was like the emotional bit that kind of made me question. I started going online and debating politics because I was raised hardcore, conservative, religious right. That was it. And so I was debating politics on the internet, and then eventually when you engage with people, you get some criticism of religion if you engage with somebody from the left. And normally I just blow that off. I'd seen it a billion times. But pretty much I saw that, I knew what love was. I still am luckily in love with my wife, and it's the best thing in the world. She was the most important thing to me. And so they were almost directly analogous to the two of us. He was a computer geek, and the other guy was just like a normal gay guy, I guess. Whatever, as if that even is valid. I don't know. He was a lot like my wife, and my other buddy was a lot like me. And so they would make jokes all the time, and it was clear as day that they were in love. They would joke about going through all the same like stupid little couple fights or stupid little couple things that everybody goes through, and they cared about each other. It was just, if you know somebody for 8 years and you're really close, you can tell when a couple is really in love or having problems or whatever. And
sure.
And so that broke through. Like there was like, how can you call that wrong? How can you call what they have wrong? And for the church, because I brought this up in the church, and they said, "Oh, you're supposed to live your life for Christ, and then they'll convert." Because I was worried, And the problem was that one, I saw a contradiction in the Bible that I couldn't call that wrong, and then that let all the criticism that I read on the internet break through, and it started making cracks, and then I basically worked in another country for 6 months because of my job. And so the work schedule was insane, and we pretty much didn't go to church while we were up there. I had my wife with me, and I had enough time to like read kind of at night when you're going to bed. So I'm reading all this internet atheist stuff and all the arguments and why I should believe. And I didn't have that constant reinforcement of my small group and the church and blow all this stuff off. And it was the argument from hell that did it. It really was. It was, ultimately you could get the argument and say, well, hell is necessary. Why would a loving God create hell? Hell is necessary for free will, which is a bunch of shit anyway, but whatever. So even if you grant that, okay, you have this eternally existing God, which is Christian theology. He's the only thing that existed eternally. And he has to choose. He knows that if he creates free will, that that necessitates hell because of his justice. And he knows that man will fall. And so he's faced with this dichotomy. You either create or not create. And you don't ever hear that dichotomy like, oh, he couldn't have created. Well, he can't create for himself because of his perfection. He has to create for us. And the Bible teaches in Matthew 7:13 through 14, most people will be condemned. It's from Jesus' words himself, his own parable, the wide path and the narrow path.
Yeah.
And so if God is perfectly good and hell is eternal conscious torture, whether you take the fire and brimstone thing or the eternal separation from God thing, mental torture, physical torture, you can't whitewash torture. So,
well, it's
the
interesting.
only God to create.
Yeah, I mean, just on that point, there's a couple of points that I find interesting about that. Well, primarily I find your deconversion interesting because the house of cards fell down as a result of indirect gay love, which I think is just a really interesting way of looking at deconversion, and I think it shows that the world is such a rich and varied place, and it just doesn't support that kind of narrow view that Christianity, or certainly that form of Christianity, perpetuates. But aside from that, the idea that God would create at all, I find really interesting. So this idea that God was an ontologically perfect being, in an ontologically perfect state of affairs, causally prior to creation. So this is God existing and the world not existing.
Nothing else exists.
Nothing else existing. So God, and God by definition is perfect. So this is an ontologically perfect state of affairs. So what would creation do to that ontological state of perfection?
Well, that's kind of like an argument that Reasonable Doubts they throw out.
Exactly, yeah. Justin Schieber and
Yep.
yeah. He uses the creation of non-God objects, which
yep.
is exactly that. So you just have to see it in the context of God having either desires or needs to create, but then of course God can't have desires or needs because God is ontologically perfect.
Right. And the answer you always get there is that he created for our benefit. He had to create because he wanted somebody. He didn't that he wanted somebody to love. He created that if he creates, then we gain existence and we can gain entry to heaven, which is perfect and wonderful in relationship with God, which is by definition the best thing ever.
But of course that demands that state of affairs has to be at least equal. Yep. If not better than God alone. And of course, even though you say God is creating for other objects, people, you've still got a state of affairs. It either has to get better, worse, or stay the same. And if you look at the world around us, is this more perfect than God?
Now, the cool thing, well, not necessarily the cool thing. I completely agree. And I think the argument from non-God objects and pretty much what you've also just described is valid. But at the time I deconverted, none of that even mattered.
No.
Because I didn't think of it at that level. Basically, I was looking at it completely from the perspective of hell. Because hell, by definition, is the worst possible state of affairs for anything. For anybody to be in hell, it is better to have not been created. It's better to non-existence is better than hell. And so, God not only is creating something that's maybe slightly less perfect than he is, or is something equivalent to him, how can God create, which was by definition, him by himself is the best thing that could ever exist by Christian theology, but now he's creating a world where the worst possible state of affairs is actual. So even if that was for a minority of creation, it would still be wrong for God to create. Like the whole, you can make a perfect society if you torture one innocent child constantly. Is that moral?
Well,
that's a thought experiment. I've heard that kind of a thing before.
I think the greatest argument against hell was used by Ray Bradley against William Lane Craig in the debate. I don't know if you've heard it, but it's absolutely brilliant. And Craig did not have a good response to it, and it went, in case listeners don't know, it went something like this. You have this world, for example, world W1, let's call it. This world is world W1, and you have in this world two subsets of people. You have subset X, which is all the people who would freely come to love God. And then you have subset Y, which is all the people who would not freely come to love God. And subset Y would go to hell. So if you took world 1, W1, if God knew, he knows all the counterfactuals, which means he knows all the scenarios that would happen. So if he knew in world 1 that subset Y would all go to hell, but subset X wouldn't go to hell and they would freely love God, why doesn't he just create a world, W2, which is identical to W1 but just with subset X, i.e. why doesn't he create a world full of people that would freely come to love God, that he already knew would freely come to love him. And therefore, you still have free will, and you don't create people just to go to hell.
I've actually been thinking about this specifically because I'm kind of wanted, after I told the deconversion story, the next video I'm going to make is positive arguments against Christianity.
Right.
And this is one of, so I looked at Craig's response there.
Yeah.
And Craig's response.
If you explain Craig's response, 'cause it's quite interesting, but I personally don't think it is good enough. But yeah, go for it.
I think I found something new I haven't heard before.
Right.
So here's the thing. He states that God, like, while that's a logically possible world, it's a world that God couldn't actualize.
Yeah.
Which, off the bat, said if it's logically possible, then God can actualize it.
Yeah.
Because that's omnipotence. You're either sacrificing omnipotence or not.
Yeah.
But the standard response, the response that it wasn't in that debate. I think that was one of the debates Craig clearly lost. But the response that I've read to this was basically that because the problem is, do you have free will in heaven? And so they always will. One of the standard Christian responses is they will have free will, but they will always freely choose to obey God. But you never can get to that state unless you've also experienced the wages of sin. So you have to have known what the world was like with sin in it.
Right.
And so you had to have made the choice for evil before and then being redeemed.
But the fact is that God would know counterfactually that if those people were in a place of sin, with sin, they would choose him anyway. So then he can take them. He knows a counterfactual from World W1, right? And he takes that subset X, the people that freely come to love him, even though they may have experienced sin in World 1, and he takes them and puts them in World 2, okay, where there might not be any sin because they freely come to love him. So even though they don't experience sin, which is what to come back you were explaining, they haven't experienced sin, but he knows that in W1 they still would have come to love him even if they had experienced sin.
Okay.
So
I think the response that you would get there is that if they had the free will and they would have loved him anyway, then they would be in heaven and then choose to sin, is what I think Craig would respond with, or whatever.
The idea is that he wouldn't even, he could just go directly to creating heaven. Like, he can literally take that subset X of people and just say, right, sod this. I don't need to do this big test on you where you could possibly end up in hell. I know you guys are good, so let's just have a big party. Well,
yes, and so the idea is, create only the people that you know will be saved, and then put them in heaven.
Yeah.
The issue is that what I believe the answer is. So I'm playing like ironically the devil's advocate.
Yeah.
Is that he would state that you still have free will in heaven. So God wants them to still have free will in heaven, but freely choose to always do good. Because remember, it's not just choose to love God; it's always choose the good thing to do. You can't sin at all in heaven. There is no sin in heaven at all. And so the idea is that you can't get to a state of having free will and always choose to do the good thing without having experienced sin or known what the wages of sin were. And so that's why I think that's how he explains why there's free will in heaven. I read a ton on that because this was the thing that deconverted me, and I was trying to go back. Yeah. So that's my I was really trying to kind of get at what is the answer, and that's how I understood the answer to.
Because the Bradley, what William Lane Craig says in the Bradley debate about these subsets of people is, like you said, God. It seems logically possible, but Craig uses a word, but it's unfeasible. And what he means by that is that if God took that subset X of people who would freely love him in World 1 and then just created them in World 2, World 2 would be a different place because World 2 wouldn't have that subset Y of people and all the interactions would be different. So in World 2, some of those people would end up
Got you. Now I see where you're going.
Yeah, would not end up. No, this is a slightly different sort of refutation.
Yeah, they would go through a world where they sinned, and then they'd be saved.
Then you'd have to say, well, those people in World 2 that would come to love him, so which would be a smaller subset, you'd have to take them out and put them into World 3. But Craig says, well, in World 3, some of them would not love him. So you go on and on until there's no one left. And of course, what Craig is saying is, like you said, it seems logically possible. It's just unfeasible. But unfeasible really means that in reality it's not possible. Therefore, it's not logically possible to do that. So
there's two responses that really so I'd heard Craig's answer, and so obviously I deconverted. So the first issue I found with that when I deconverted was if you look at Craig's moral argument, and so I actually think the Euthyphro dilemma is fantastic because it forces them to define goodness as God's nature. And so when they go that route, it is logically impossible for God to sin. God is goodness, so he can't sin. And if God can't sin, then God doesn't have free will with respect to morality. So God has free will to he could have made the sky red instead of blue, or pick a color, something trivial. He still has free will in that respect. But he can't value moral free will because it's not good. By definition, it's not good because goodness is God, and God can't go against his own nature. So he would have to value something that is not good in order for free will to be for something to be valuable.
So what you're saying effectively is the definition of free will, or at least, the definition of free will invalidates the whole scenario. So the definition of good even is that the definition of good for humans is being able to freely. Let me get this right. I'm gonna have to go back here.
So you need to be so the whole point is that why create a world where sin is possible? And the answer to that is because God values the actions of morally free creatures. The answer is that a world with morally free creatures is more valuable than a world where no evil is possible. Yeah. Because people freely choose to follow good or God or whatever it is. But God can't value that because he doesn't have that free will choice. He
because
cannot
in order to have free will,
by definition is not good. But by the theist definition is not good.
But in order to have free will, you need to have experienced the weight of sin.
Oh no, you don't necessarily need the weight. Christianity would not hold to that, or at least not the versions that I think Craig holds to, because you had Adam and Eve had free will by their so man freely chose. The whole thing of original sin doesn't work unless you have free will to start with. So the whole reason sin's in the world is their answer to that is it's our fault. It's humanity's fault. And so we chose to sin. We chose not good. And so therefore we have a fallen world. And so the question is why would you create a world where we could fall? And so the answer is free will is valuable.
But what you were saying about heaven is that that humans you were talking about would need to have experienced a weight of sin in order to be able to choose good. Is that not what you were saying about free will in heaven?
So to have free will in heaven is to have free will where you will always choose to do good. So you have free will, but you'll always choose to do the good thing. That's technically, logically possible, right? You always could sin, but you won't, ever. Yeah. And so the only way to get, because that's the question is do you have free will in heaven? And because you're never supposed to be able to sin again. Yeah. And if you don't have free will in heaven, then why is free will valuable at all? So that was the whole, to get that version of free will where you'll never sin again is that you will have had to experience, having sinned or what the wages of sin were before you would be like, I will never do anything that could bring that about again. But the whole point of why would God, why create a world where we could fall anyway? So you're not even, you can't, the whole thing kind of gets it's like an undercutting defeater, I think is what it would be called. So why would free will be valuable in the first place? So I think it was something that Bradley brought up in the debate, at the end of the Q&A, And he said, well, what's the value of free will? And Craig didn't get to answer because he got cut off because of time. Yeah, he really cornered him in that. Craig was clearly wasting time on the clock.
Yeah.
Just to try to avoid that QA. If you listen to the QA, you could tell he went on about all sorts of things, and it was like, wow. Like somebody had pointed out, he's blowing time because he doesn't want to have to. Who wants to be under that firing squad?
Yeah. Oh, I'm gonna have to listen to that again because I didn't notice that. I think I was listening to that debate once while walking around a supermarket, so I probably wasn't. I remember walking around in like a frozen aisle.
The issue that got me out. I listened to that debate so many times.
Yeah, I remember walking around a frozen aisle going, "That's a damn good argument against hell." That I'm gonna have to go back home and write that down.
Well, so here's another thing. This was actually I'm kind of come up with this video that I want to do based on the argument from hell. And so even I'm going on the assumption that you could get that free will, the whole it's not feasible thing. So I kind of like to look at things like, okay, even if we grant your premise, even if we grant that's possible, it's going to contradict with other parts of theology or other things that they don't want to give up. And so the idea is that God has to create, he gets people in heaven, he knows that people are going to be in hell, and he's totally cool with it. And so people had to experience sin in order to have this free will where they'll never choose to do evil again. So that's how you get that eternity of no sin, no tears in heaven. That is incompatible with the idea of infant or handicapped salvation,
right?
Which is Craig needs in his defense of the genocide shit.
Yeah,
because well, don't worry. He killed it. God ordered killing babies, but don't worry. It was great for them because now they're in heaven because that's what I believe.
Yeah.
And if you look up the biblical justification for that, if you want to see some crappy theology, go read that stuff. It's verses out of context or taking just giant leaps because they don't want to have to admit that infants that die before the age of accountability, which doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
Did you hear Justin Schieber on Unbelievable, the Christian radio show in Britain, debate John Alistair on the Amalekite slaughter? That was a classic.
And so the idea was that that's kind of where the whole thing came from. I mean, I think when you're trying to deconvert someone and you're looking at arguments to show, look, and you're giving an internal critique of Christianity and saying, this is not, there's the whole we don't believe in God because there's no evidence for one, but that doesn't help when people have just kind of accepted it. So when I want to for my deconversion, it was, this shit don't make sense. And so I'm looking for arguments that show, look, here's things that you hold, here's things you can't give up. And it doesn't make sense. Because internally, not even looking at science and all that other stuff.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting, I think that's a really good point, and something I've said quite a lot of times in the past. I think I said it in my book, The Little Book of Unholy Questions, is that often either theodicies or kind of theological get out of jail free cards that are played to defend certain situations or certain criticisms made of religion, they'll give a response because it gets them out of the sticky situation. But of course, it doesn't necessarily cohere with another response that they give in another theological wrangle, which doesn't play well with a theodicy that they've given like a year before in whatever. And actually, theologians, it's a patchwork quilt of kind of defences that just don't work well. They don't make a very coherent pattern.
Right, and that was the first thing that, like, the whole free will thing. That's how I got past the hell argument.
Yeah.
And so it was listening to all these apologetics, and you hear the moral argument a million times. And Craig was pretty much he's one of the most prolific that you'll find on the internet, and he obviously sounds the best, I think.
Yeah.
At least out of the people who are prolific.
I mean, he's rhetorically brilliant. There's no doubt about it.
He can work a mic.
Yeah.
And so it was basically like, if you look at the moral argument, then this whole definition of goodness and free will just doesn't hold up. I think that's the best way of kind of going at it. So one of the things I'm trying to do is formulate an argument against hell, and you say, well, all right, fine, you're going to have your free will response, but then you don't have you have to have experienced sin to have this special free will in heaven, because you have, say mentally disabled or infants who are supposedly automatically saved. One of the hilarious things I read in critiques of infant salvation from a theology perspective was justification by youth alone. And so you'd have them, and they would never, by definition, they never had free will. They were never able to choose evil. And so while they might still have original sin, they don't know by definition, they wouldn't know what it was. So they can't have that special free will in heaven.
Yeah, I'll tell you what. There's one of my contributors to Tippling Philosopher, the blog on Skeptic Inc. network I run, wrote a couple of posts on infant salvation, which might be of use to you or might be of interest to you, and how he wrote it from a Calvinist point of view, but because there's some interesting sort of defences of Calvinism with regard to infant salvation, because it's a bit of an issue. But yeah, there's some really. He formulated a logical argument, which I think is pretty useful.
The church I ended up in when I was an adult was Calvinist. It's insider baseball. It's a bit different from Baptist,
right.
And so they were open-minded enough where the whole predestination versus personal election thing kind of was like, we're like, well, we'll let you in if even if you don't go with the predestination bit, because it's an unknowable thing, because there's Bible verses that support both, which at the time sounded really profound in Sunday school. Now I look at it and go, wow, it's a contradiction, and you're like, yeah, it's a contradiction. And the answer to the contradiction was, in Bible class, I shit you not, was, it's one of the first questions I'm going to ask the Lord when I get to heaven.
Brilliant, that's like, fine.
Really?
Yeah. That's great then,
Yep. But yeah, I like to say Calvinism, where Christians admit God's a dick. Because, hey, I'm going to create people who are going to go to hell because I can.
Yeah.
Go for it. I just say preach it.
Yeah.
I had a debate back and forth with one of my old pastors, who I'm still one of the few people I'm still friends with from the church, and we were going back and forth, and he goes, "Yeah, faith isn't based on reason at all."
Brilliant.
And I was like, "Really?" I was like, "Go for it." I was like, "Just preach that. If you could please preach that every Sunday, I would love it. Just go." And so I'm waiting to hear anything back.
Because if it's based on evidence only, if it's only evidentialist, then you're up shit creek too. Oh dear.
Exactly.
So, given that there's obviously a couple of arguments that you find particularly difficult for theism, what argument do you find difficult for atheism? What do you think is the biggest challenge to atheism as far as an argument goes?
The arguments. See, so I had this experience trying to deconvert my wife, and she never really was this hardcore indoctrinated Christian thing that I was, and she's actually still a deist,
right?
Right, and so she obviously doesn't believe in Christianity. She goes, look, we can't really know, but if you're going to put a gun to my head, I'm going to think there's some kind of a clockwork creator. And what's persuasive to her is the fine tuning and basically the cosmological style. There had to be something. And she goes, she doesn't really.
She's not been listening to you enough on the Kalam, mate.
Well, it's not necessarily the Kalam or anything like that. She goes, look, it could have been either or. She's very honest about it. But she does not like to debate.
No.
She's not a fan of discussing it at all. And so
so just to wrap up a couple of questions then. So the argument from fine tuning and sort of cosmological arguments would be the most difficult for you through your wife.
Pretty much. I mean, they're the arguments you'll hear if you ask somebody who does not think about this at all, and most people don't think about this. I'm of the opinion that the vast majority of people who are in churches or identify as religious have no clue what their theology is.
Yeah.
Especially as somebody who's gone through and had to take tests on this crap for 12 years.
Yeah.
A lot of people have no clue, and they don't really think about it. Most people have premarital sex. Most people don't, but a lot of people are divorced. A lot of people don't go to church every week.
Yeah.
They certainly don't tithe. I was a trustee. Believe me, we know they don't.
Yeah.
They don't give, and they're driving in a Mercedes.
Yeah.
So, if you push them on why do you believe, then you're going to get something along those lines. And maybe the moral pops up every so often, but I don't think you'll. In a pluralistic society, that doesn't hold up very well. I think the moral argument lines, because we're in these, the U.S., UK, we value multiculturalism, or we have to tolerate multiculturalism because we realize if we don't, we kill each other.
Yeah. So, in the same way, just briefly, what would be a similar challenge for? I assume you're a kind of metaphysical naturalist. So what would you find is a big challenge for naturalism in that way for you?
I mean, I kind of want to sign up for it, but the problem is that I don't know. I don't necessarily know. If you sign up for it, invariably what I find is that you'll get challenged on some bit that I have no clue what it is.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I haven't read enough.
Yeah.
But I mean, obviously, I do think the natural world is all that there is.
Yeah.
Maybe you'd get the infinite regress argument, and so the whole timelessness bit kind of comes up, but then that's where this whole space-time thing kind of comes in, which is why I guess I focused on this neo-Lorentzian B theory and space-time relativity stuff. So that's an intuitive way to think about time, and so everybody kind of assumes it. That's why the Kalam argument works so damn well. It's intuitive. Yeah. And so when you look at what the evidence shows as how you should think time progresses or what it is a property of, it's a property of space itself, 3 dimensions. It's actually 4. Well, if you think of a space-time entity as a whole existing in some greater multiverse or something where time doesn't exist, or time as we understand it doesn't exist, it could be completely different notions of time compared to what we understand time to be, if time is a measure of change or however you look at it. He doesn't necessarily have. There's Craig's definition of timeless, which is changeless, which he needs for his argument to work. But you could still say that something's oscillating, and if it's always oscillating between 2 different things or potentials or a variety of potentials, then you don't necessarily have to have time as we have it in space-time. So people will argue against, say, an eternally existing universe, especially with all the apologetics that I guess you find out now. They want, for whatever reason, they think something supernatural has to be the thing that has always existed, necessarily.
Yeah, and again, that there doesn't seem to, intuitively to me anyway, be any more probability. In fact, using Occam's razor, I would say that the universe as a brute fact is more simplistic and therefore slightly more attractive than the universe and another entity which is potentially more or less understandable, which is God. God plus universe or universe.
Right. It's the simpler assumption, and I think that's why you get a lot of vitriol against atheists, because we kind of we undermine these intuitive assumptions that a lot of people make, and when people realize that they have the burden of proof that in these discussions, then it makes them very unhappy.
Yeah, fair play. Cool. Okay. Well, look. That was a nice, interesting interview, and hopefully, maybe who knows, we can do this again.
Certainly.
And
I just got to schedule it. That's the whole problem. My baby's 4 months, so.
Yeah. No worries. Well, look, stay on the line, and we'll just chat a second more. But thank you very much for taking time to be interviewed by a Tippling Philosopher. I seriously advise people to check out Counter Apologist. If you want to give your blog URL, that'd be great, because it's a fantastic blog.
No, thank you very much, and thank you for having me. It's a lot of fun. I'm at counterapologist.blogspot.com, or if you just go to YouTube and search for Counter Apologist, I'll pop up there. So
awesome. Cheers, mate. Really appreciate that.
Thank you.